Once again, this is Andrew Klein, and this is video 15 of my compositing video series. We've been looking at using After Effects just most recently to put some shots together. I'll be working in two scene files in this video. I want to talk a bit about color grading, and I want to talk a bit about creating layers and appropriate compositions. This is sort of the final composition, which I'm aiming towards here, where all of my layers have come together in this shot. And what I'm actually doing is I'm starting to put this together now. It's a new image with very similar renders that we've looked at previously. Occlusion images, I have a clouds image, I have a flat colors image, just a whole bunch of different elements. I'm bringing this one in because I also have a depth pass here that I'm going to use for some blurring effects. And I also have a sky pass to cut this out, and I kind of want to talk about all of these cutout elements. Now, my composition, again, I just want to make sure it's 32 bits per channel while I'm working here. Here's my base, and this is what I'm starting off with. This is my master image. This is a pretty huge image here. I actually rendered this image out for print, so its image size is pretty gigantic. My settings that I'm working on here, this is a 7,600 pixel document by 3,300 pixels. So this is a huge image, and we can kind of see all the detail that I'm getting as a result on this. So here's another character of mine. He's the main character. He's on his little hill. I have all the little cows and the rest of the herd here. And I have my really low resolution sky that I used as part of my sky dome in the background. Well, on this sky, this is not the sky that I want to use. Instead, I want to use these clouds, the much crisper render clouds that I made and brought out of my direct scene in View, View 9. And I just want to kind of put those in behind my main shot. So I'm going to take my clouds and drag them down to the scene right here. And I'm actually just going to put this behind my master layer. So if I turn my master layer off, I see these clouds behind. Well, I need to somehow cut out my master layer, and here's where creating that sky mask that I was talking about previously is really helpful. Here I have a mask, white. I applied a white surface shader in Maya to all of the foreground elements. I left my background color as black, and I have this sky mask. I'm going to drag it down on my composition, but I'm not going to leave it on. I'm going to turn its visibility off by clicking the eyeball on its layer. I'll then go to Master, the Master Beauty layer, and go to Effect, Channel, and choose Set Matte. Here, I'm going to take my matte from my depth and sky, this is my sky mask, and I'm going to use its luminance. So I'll use for matte the luminance elements. And again, this is a big image, so it's going to take a second for it to composite out. But once I have that, and I look at the set matte, you can see it's now cutting out the cheap sky that I have with the actual render plate sky. So that's kind of cool. That gives me my sort of full sky effect. I have some other layers here. I'll just sort of reiterate these from the previous tutorial. Here's my occlusion image. I'll add this in with a blending mode of multiply on top. I have my specular image, which is going to go on top with an additive overlay, blending mode, add. And again, I usually like to give like a little bit of Gaussian blur to this, just to get that highlight blowout. Gotta forgive my computer, it's chugging through some pretty big images right now while video recording. So where are we here? Here's my highlights. Let's see how I can crank this up and really get some good specular blur off of that. There we go. There's my specular blur. I could probably go about like 25 pixels worth since this image is so big. And now I have this really interesting shine here, kind of coming off the side of my building. Just like before, I can tint all of this. So Effect, Color Correction, Tint, and I'll map my white into a much warmer tonal range, somewhere in these oranges. and get me a nice little warm glow off the side of that. This pretty much kind of covers some of the basics of this here. What I do want to do though is I want to apply a blur to this image. And to do this, I'm actually going to make a new composition, same overall settings, and I'm going to nest my original composition into this composition layer. I'm also going to drag down my depth and sky depth pass that I had generated by generating out my distance depth. I had talked about this in video 4 in this series. This is obviously a different shot than the one I was working with, but you can see here that my foreground is all white. My cows here are getting a little gray and they recede to nothing in the background. Well, to blur out my image based on that depth pass, I'll select this nested composition, and I'm going to go to Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Lens Blur. My depth map layer, I'm going to choose as my depth image, and I'm going to use its luminance to generate that. Now it's going to take a second for it to calculate here, but what I'm going to have is this ability to blur based on the depth gradient that I've created. So again, I'm just going to wait for this to zoom in. Sorry for the delay. And when we come back here from the computer chugging a bit, you'll notice that my foreground is out of focus and my background is really crisply in focus. I'm going to change the iris radius to a really extreme, like 40. And when I change it to 40, you can see here that my foreground is really out of focus, and my background is pretty crisply in focus. So you can see kind of where it is decided to blur. Right now my camera is just clearly focused on the background. I can actually invert my depth map by clicking here on the invert depth map in the lens blur, and that is going to inverse what I have. And you can see here, once it inverts the depth map, that I have my foreground really crisply in focus and my background is now out of focus. And this can be really, really advantageous to kind of draw your eye into the main character. So I've got, the main character here pretty clearly in, and, everything else just kind of blurry. So this is actually a pretty cool look, and I'm very happy with this. Although you'll notice here, kind of like right along the edge, that I have this sort of dark fringing. One of the things that I always recommend doing when applying a lens blur is what it does is it tries to blur beyond the edge of the image, and it's just finding black out here. So what you want to do is you want to turn on repeat edge pixels. And when I turn this on, you'll obviously see here that the fringing goes away. So I can use that to kind of clean up my borders, and this kind of gives me a really cool depth blur. So it's a very, very fast way to do this, way faster than I think rendering out in Maya. Now you do notice, because I did this blur here, if I zoom in, I don't know if this is readable in video, especially maybe on like YouTube where it's probably already pretty banded, but I am starting to get some banding here from my blurring, and that's because of the fact that even though I've got a 32-bit composition, my base render here in this case was actually 8 bits for this render. So I am going to get a little bit of distortion here once I start pushing this pretty far. When you zoom out, obviously it's not going to be noticeable, and since I'm rendering with such a huge image, when I scale this down, it's probably going to look fine, but this is one thing that I would be concerned about. So we can now actually get into some color grading here, and I want to do sort of like 2 elements of color grading on this shot. The first is going to be back here on my master layer. What I'm going to do is create a depth fog effect, which I can use to kind of fade out or create aerial perspective back in the distance. In my After Effects sort of a layer element down below where I've got my timeline going, I'll right click and choose New Solid, and it's going to ask me what I want to do with my solid. My size should be pretty much the same size as my images. For color, I'm just going to get the eyedropper, and I can choose a color here already in my document. I'm going to choose like this gray-green here. I can also just manually pick a color, but I'm going to choose one similar to that background, and I'm going to say OK. This is going to put this pale green solid on top of my shot. Now I'll just take my depth layer, which I've got here, and I'm going to cut out my pale green solid with Effect, Channel, Set Matte. Again, I'll take my matte from my Depth Passes Luminance channel. And what I'm going to get here once this composite's in is I'm going to get the mask being kind of cut out, or that solid being cut out by my depth mask. So you can see here it's now got like this cyan blue-green color almost in the foreground. And that's obviously backwards here, so I'm going to again hit Invert Matte, and that's going to invert the direction of this. And I'm going to get this fog effect here in my background. You can see what it's doing here with my cows, how they're kind of fading into the background, because it's masking out the pale green, gray-green solid with that fog effect. And if I want to tone that down, I can just change the opacity of this effect, and that's going to dial it all the way back down. So I'll just sort of like work my way back up till I get this where I want it. And I can go maybe right about here and add a little bit of that fog in, or whatever I desire. So that's my my fog effect. Again, I think it's a pretty cool one. I'll go back to my final master composition. And here I could apply a little bit of color grading if I want as well. So for this, I'm going to again make another new solid. Let's make this solid a little bit more purple. I'm going to put this thing right on top, so it's an all purple solid. To cut this out and to kind of do some color grading, what I do is I make a new mask, and I can do this with the pen tool. With my layer selected, I'll just sort of like click some pen points and then click back to the start to finish that up. And you'll notice this is now just going to put that solid right on top. I'm going to change my blend mode. I'm going to change it to overlay, soft light, hard light, multiply, some of the ones that I use constantly. I like overlay for my color grading. I think it gives me a nice illumination look. And I'm going to just tone down the overall opacity of this because it was really purple. So let's put this at like 30%. Right there. So you see I've now got some purple on one side of the shot and green on the other side of the shot. And what I'm going to do here is in my mask, I'm going to open up my mask down in my timeline. I'll click on the triangle next to mask and then mask 1. And I'm going to feather my mask a little bit. To do this, I'm going to click the Break Connections, the Constrain Proportions button. It's a little chain link, which will make sure that I can kind of blur the horizontal and vertical differently. So if I dial up the first number, you see this is actually going to blur a bit side to side. It's horizontal then vertical. That's the way these two numbers work. So I can kind of do this and blur it a bit side to side. Now my image is really huge, so I've got to actually blur this by quite a few pixels. I'm going to try blurring it by 2000 pixels in this case. And you see I've now got this gradient image right here where it's blurring that all out. I can tone down my color, and this can be like a really sort of subtle way to try and get some color balance into your shot. I'm going to actually do this in a more sophisticated way with the other shot that I was working on. So let me go ahead and reopen back up this shot with the soldier. So here, let's add a new solid as well. Maybe I'll make a sort of dark blue solid on this. I'm going to set its blend mode to overlay. And I'm going to tone down the opacity to about 30%. Now what I can also do with this is, if I'm really precise, I can use my pen tool to create a really very specific mask. So I'm just going to kind of like trace the edge of the shapes that I see here. What I'm trying to do is create a drop shadow underneath this awning. Go down to about here, over to here, over to there. And I can actually edit these points if I desire to after the fact to create a little bit of a gradient there. So you see I've got a slightly darker area up here at the top. Now what I can do with this is I can start to blur this mask, and I can blur it vertically. And with a little bit of vertical blur, this can be enough to just pop a deeper shadow right along that top ridge. To get a little bit of warm glow, maybe down near the bottom, let's add another solid here. This time I'll take a orange, add this in, and again, one of my favorite blending modes is overlay. Here I'll create a mask pretty much just along this bottom section. Again, I'll open up my mask, and I'm going to edit the mask feathering in just the vertical axis. I think I'm going to change the blend mode here actually from overlay to soft light, which may be a bit subtler. And again, I'm adding in a bit more warmer tone down at the bottom, and that's kind of the whole point of this. I also use this to create like a little bit of a glow on the outside. Let's create another new solid. This time I'm going to make it yellow. Put this right on top. I'll do a blend mode. Maybe I'll try like a hard light this time. With my pen, I'm going to create a little bit of a corner. Since this is a Bezier curve tool, I'm just going to click and hold, kind of like draw out this elongated tangent, and then sort of connect it across. Go back to my regular pointer tool, and I can kind of extend this out so I've got a little bit of a glowing corner. Now here in my masks on my yellow solid, I'm going to be able to blur that, give it a little bit of mask expansion, but again, I'm just feathering this out pretty huge. And then under transform, I'll just dial back the opacity. Let's try something like 20%. And this little color blowout here can make it look like there's some light leak coming from the upper corner. So when I'm working with shots, and when compositing artists work with shots, oftentimes beyond the actual Maya lighting, there's a lot of this additional sort of color grading where you're applying colors with different masks. Now when I was actually working with this shot, what I had was, and let me see if I can open this up. This will be the official shot. I'll just give it a second. So what I had was a couple of different overlays. I had this cyan overlay that I kind of used to illuminate the center. I also applied a bit of vignetting which is this darkening in the corners. This is actually an image I made in Photoshop and brought in. So it kind of mimics an effect that you sometimes get in a camera where the corners are crushed to black. And if I set this back to a normal blend mode, you'll see what this image actually is. It's just a little gradient image I made in Photoshop. And I just applied that on at a very low opacity to give it a slightly more realistic or more photographic feel. On my background image, I had applied a bunch of different color grades here. There was my purple that I had applied to the background, which you can see did some toning here, just kind of where the shadow areas are. There's my yellow solid, which I kind of applied across the whole thing as a way to tint this. There's my orange, which I had applied to the bottom, as you'd seen a second ago. I had made this blue solid to tint the shadows on just these columns. There's this blue solid I had applied to kind of tint the top roof a slightly different color. This orange solid, which I used to tint the corner. We saw me do that a minute ago as well. This purple here, which I actually used to cut out, create a little shadow on the newspaper stand, make that read a bit better. Same thing with the other newspaper stand as well. And then I had this magenta solid to kind of tone this top-down element. And again, you saw me do that a few minutes ago. So just to kind of wrap this up, what you'll see when you're working with compositing shots and when professional artists are working doing their compositing is that what makes the final image oftentimes is multiple different effects, multiple different render layers, multiple different render passes, everything composited together and then drawn on top of using masks, cutting things out, creating gradients. These are the things that are going to make your shot work, and these are the things that you should be experimenting with to improve the quality of your overall work. This has been video 15 where we've taken a look at color grading and using masks. I have only one more video in this series, video 16, where I want to talk about how to export images out of After Effects. So please stay tuned for the 16th and final video in this series.